Put out into the deep waters and let your nets down for a catch. Please be seated. Many will remember that in the late spring and summer of 2010, our national attention was focused on a precise location deep at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. The Deepwater Horizon oil rig had exploded and sunk to the bottom, killing 11 people and severing its connection at the sea floor, resulting in the largest oil spill in history. In fact, those of you who can remember this will recall that it very quickly became the largest oil spill in history and continued to add to that total, spilling out hundreds and hundreds of gallons, thousands of gallons, I'm sure, every day into the Gulf of Mexico, which of course rose to the surface and did terrible damage to the whole coastline. The problem was that it was so deep that the very best engineers couldn't find a way to manage the kind of precision fix that would allow them to cap an active well so far down at the floor of the ocean. And I remember watching the grainy video from right by the well as the oil continued to jet into the water. We could just as easily have been watching the Apollo 13 mission, as we're watching the best and the brightest trying to solve this problem so close to us and yet so far away at such an inaccessible point. The water and the well were just too deep. It was capped that September, but of course not without vast damage to the ecosystem. It was a lesson on environmental stewardship, one hopes, but it also, I think, served as a reminder of something that many of us don't think of on a day-to-day basis, and that is that the deep water is a place of great vulnerability and risk, and even danger. And what happens in those far away and often deep down places, what happens there is far beyond our power to control. The outcomes are not ours to decide, and happy endings are not assured. The deep water, in fact, haunts us, even though as human beings we are drawn to it. The mystery, the danger of it. Going back to an even earlier memory when I was a boy, about the time that the Titanic wreck was discovered, National Geographic, of course, came out with a wonderful article, and in that they had a graphic that showed just how deep it was by stacking pictures of the Empire State Building, 9 Empire State Buildings, top to bottom, to give an impression of just how far that ship had sunk after it had crashed apart. The Titanic, of course, is in the deep, and it holds a place in our imagination as what happens when we ignore the perils of the deep. But you know who does not ignore those perils? People who make their living on the sea. Throughout history, anyone who goes to the ocean to live their lives knows that the danger is real. In fact, think about those wonderful old medieval maps that, yes, they show the other continents, they show the known world, but you also have those serpents and dragons kind of roiling and curling in and out of the oil of the water, and a marker that says, this is a dangerous place, here be dragons. And it's not meant ironically, is it? It's real. The danger is real, and the cartographers who gave us those maps were not only telling us where things were, but issuing a stern warning. The deep is a dangerous place. But you know what? That's exactly where Jesus sends us. I don't think the danger of the deep water was missed by the disciples, even though it was their job to go there. Jesus says to them, as they are recovering from a long and futile night of catching precisely nothing. We've all been there, right? Jesus says to them, go back one more time. Find the deep water once again, and when you're there, I want you to put your nets out. The deep water, of course, is a place of risk and danger, but it's also one of mystery. Jesus is encouraging them to trust God beyond the limits of what they've already seen. Lutheran pastor Ken Ramon writes that Jesus' mentioning of the deep water implies that there may be unexplored areas of potential beyond the perceived limits of resources, knowledge, and energy. Imagine that there may be something to discover far beyond the limits of our own imagination and thought. Imagine that. This is what we find in the deep waters. Yes, there is danger, but there is also rich reward to be found in those deep places. Howard Thurman writes of the inward sea, a place deep within, one that we really can only access through silence and contemplation, where, he says, the hidden altar of our heart is located, where God lives in us, and where nothing can be placed on that altar without the mark of our inner authority. That, too, is the deep. Now, I like that a whole lot better than an oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. But you know what? They're both real. The danger is real, but also the richness of the mystery where, amid risk and adventure, we connect deeply, deeply to God. Going into the deep waters means placing all our trust on God. There is no technological innovation that will guarantee our safety. The only way to stay perfectly safe is to sit down on a beach chair and let time pass. Although someone at an earlier service reminded me to also pay attention to the tides. There is no emotional game or hack that will allow us to find that inward sea without the courage to sail a little bit farther away from the shore. All of this takes vulnerability. And that's why trust matters. That's why trust matters. Trust is a big part of going to the deep waters. And we have to have trust if we're going to get there. And we certainly have to have it if we're going to get anywhere together. Now think about this. In order for if it's a group of sailors, yes, but really for any group, whether we're a church, whether we're a community, whether we're a family, it doesn't matter. If we're going to go anywhere of consequence together, then we're going to have to trust one another. Trust is a willingness to invest in one another's well-being, an assumption of good intentions, and the capacity to accept that even with our best efforts, things won't always break our way. But to get anywhere, we still have to trust one another. But there's trust, and then there's something else, something that we live with also, and that's turf. Turf. Do you know what I mean when I use that word? Okay, turf is when we hold on to something at the expense of somebody else's something. Right? It's politics at its worst. We can see it in the worst forms in so many ways. It's when we say, yeah, we're all in this together, but I need to get my thing first, We know that is not a very good feeling. We've all been turfed out, and probably we've all held a little ground every once in a while, too. It's human nature. We rarely know that we're doing it. But it's helpful to know that it's a thing. Turf is something that we understand too. But I recently read that turf and trust are in an almost perfect inverse relationship with one another. What I mean here is this. When we turf, it's actually because we don't trust. But when we do trust, we no longer feel that need to turf. Right? That doesn't mean that the things we're talking about aren't important. But it does mean that if there's no trust, then suddenly we lose a capacity to connect, and we want to stand on our own private islands, if you will. So when we catch ourselves turfing, that's when we know that what we really need is to build some trust. Doesn't mean we can't have conflict, doesn't mean we can't disagree about things of importance. That's not what I mean. What I'm talking about is when we see that trust has gone away, and when we feel that, that's when we know that trust, which is rooted in the ability to see and honor the dignity in every human being, that is the thing that we are most missing. And that is what we need if we are going to put out and head out into the deep waters. Because what happens when we head into those risky, frightening, adventurous places? Whether we're in a ship all rowing together, or if we're in our own little rowboat kind of working our way on backwards. When we go to that place, our trust is tested. We find that we cannot survive without being willing to trust the one who created us, who has called us into the deep, and who hungers for us to explore the depths of our own spiritual lives. In order to do that, we have to be able to go with an open heart and a willingness to be vulnerable. We have to be able to trust God's providence. We just have to. Because at that point, now imagine once again that where are we? We're heading out into the great ocean. We see quickly that trust is what we've got. And if trust and turf are mutually exclusive, think about that for just a minute. What are you going to have when you go into the deep? Are you going to have trust or are you going to have turf? I'll give you a hint. There's not a lot of turf in the middle of the ocean. I'm going to go with 0. There is 0 turf. There's none of it. Which means it's all trust. It's all about trusting in God. That means that a journey into the deep calls from us a complete trust, a complete openness before God, a willingness, despite everything our lives tell us, to put those nets overboard once more. Always, once more. Put out into the deep and let down your nets. Now, all of this sounds a little bit risky, though, doesn't it? Going to sea is dangerous and often lonely work. It still is, by the way. So maybe turf isn't looking so bad after all. A lot of nice things happen on turf. Most of my life has happened on turf. I'm pretty happy here. So why go? Why go? Well, I'm reminded of the old story of Willie Sutton, who I'm sure you've heard this story, who in the 1930s was asked why he robbed banks. Have you heard this? He said, "I rob banks because that's where the money is." Why did Jesus say to go out into the deep water to cast your nets? Because that's where the fish were. And why does Jesus beckon us all into these deeper waters? Away from safety, away from despair, and into places of risk and mystery and sacrifice. I think Jesus beckons us to those places because that is where we find abundant life. The deep waters are where we find abundant life. The disciples were ready to give up. We have all been there. They were tired, they were exhausted, they were over it, they just wanted to go to bed. I was talking to our youth group this morning. I said they just wanted a good night's sleep. I'm so proud of them. They were reading the text, and they said no, they wanted a good day's sleep because they've been up all night. So they were paying attention, and that's good. They were exhausted. They didn't want to go back out there. And Jesus says, go back out. And what happens? They cast their nets out, and they bring in a catch that surpasses their wildest dreams. They bring back a catch that is pure abundance. And it's not just good news for Peter and Andrew's family business. They bring in so many fish that it's more than the fishermen can eat. It's more than they can sell. It's more than they can trade. It is so much, it sinks the boat just a little bit into the water, and the only thing they can do with this is share all of this fish with all of the people on land who are so hungry. This is actually not just about the fishermen, it's about the whole community. The deep waters are where we find abundant life. For ourselves, yes, but also for all of us around us as well. Because as children of God, we are deeply interconnected with one another. Jesus sends us into the deep water, to places of mystery, risk, and adventure. Because that's where we find abundant life. It's there that we cast our nets and bring in a catch that surpasses our needs and our expectations, our imagination of what was possible. And when we travel into the deep, we learn to trust in God, to see the catch that comes in as it becomes a gift, not just for us, but for the whole world. We will fish for people, to be sure, but not as commodities for consumption, but rather as companions who come alongside as we return again and again and again to those places of sacredness and depth.